In the glass towers of Manhattan's financial district, a brilliant strategist was about to challenge the most powerful man in her company. What started as a routine client presentation took a shocking turn when she came face to face with blatant workplace discrimination. Alexis Ward wasn't your typical corporate climber. For 5 years, she had spent her life meticulously building her reputation at McKinsey Sterling, known for her razor-sharp analysis and unshakable composure under fire. When she encountered her new division director's sexist dismissal, "Women can't handle pressure," in front of the entire executive team, she had no idea she was walking into the fight that would define her career. Alexis made a decision that would lead to exposing a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. What began as public humiliation would become total vindication. The consulting world would never be the same after she proved that integrity could be more profitable than corruption. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The conference room on the 42nd floor of McKinsey Sterling smelled like expensive coffee and buried ambitions. Alexis Ward adjusted her blazer, navy blue, conservative, the kind that said "I belong here" without being loud about it, and clicked to her final slide. The morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows cast sharp shadows across the mahogany table where 12 executives sat, half listening, half scrolling through their phones. "As you can see from the data," Alexis said, her voice steady despite the familiar flutter in her chest, "our Q3 client retention dropped by 18%, but the pattern isn't random. It's concentrated in mid-tier accounts where we've reduced face time by 40%. She paused, watching Calvin Mercer lean back in his chair at the head of the table, his expression already shifting toward dismissal. "The correlation suggests our efficiency drive is actually driving clients away." Alexis had spent 3 weeks on this analysis, pulling late nights in her cramped office, cross-referencing client communications with project timelines. She'd traced the problem to its source, the new directive from Calvin's division to minimize non-billable client interactions. But she knew better than to say that directly. Not yet. Calvin's fingers drummed against the table. At 38, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never had to earn his place in rooms like this. His tailored suit probably cost more than Alexis made in a month, and his smile had that practiced warmth that never quite reached his eyes. "Interesting theory, Alexis," he said, her name coming out like he was tasting something slightly off. "But correlation isn't causation. Have you considered that these mid-tier clients might simply be outgrowing us?" The subtle dig landed exactly where he'd aimed it. Several executives shifted in their seats. Alexis felt the familiar burn in her chest, the same feeling she'd had in college debate when opponents would question her preparation instead of addressing her arguments. The same feeling she'd swallowed countless times in 5 years at this firm. "Actually," she said, clicking to a backup slide she'd hoped not to need, "I contacted 15 of these former clients directly. 12 cited lack of personal attention as their primary reason for switching firms. 3 specifically mentioned feeling like we'd stopped caring about their success." The room went quiet. Calvin's drumming stopped. "You contacted clients without approval?" His voice carried a dangerous edge now. "Former clients," Alexis corrected. "And yes, I followed proper protocol through client relations." She hadn't. Technically, but Sandra in client relations owed her a favor and had rubber-stamped the request retroactively. Calvin stood, smoothing his tie with practiced precision. The motion drew every eye in the room to him, exactly as intended. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he said, his voice carrying the weight of disappointed authority. "This kind of reactive thinking, jumping to conclusions, making unauthorized contacts." His gaze swept the room before landing back on Alexis. "Women can't handle pressure." The words hit the room like a physical force. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Someone's coffee cup clinked against the table. Outside, a plane droned past in the sudden silence. Alexis felt her face grow hot, but she kept her expression neutral. Years of being the only woman in rooms like this had taught her that any visible reaction would be dissected, analyzed, and used against her later. Calvin's comment hung in the air like smoke, poisoning everything it touched. Grace Hollander, the chief legal officer, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Tom Richardson from operations cleared his throat and suddenly found his phone fascinating. The CEO, Marcus Webb, glanced at Calvin with something that might have been disapproval, but didn't speak. "The data stands on its own," Alexis said finally, her voice steady as glass. "Client retention is down, and the pattern is clear. We can address it or continue to lose revenue." She closed her laptop with a soft click. "I'll send the full report to everyone by end of day." Calvin was already moving toward the door. "Make sure you include proper methodology next time," he said over his shoulder. And run any client outreach by me first. We can't have people going rogue. As the room began to empty, Alexis gathered her materials with methodical precision. Her hands weren't shaking. That was something, at least. Grace Hollander paused at her chair, her expression unreadable. Good analysis, Grace said quietly. Thorough. It wasn't much, but coming from Grace, who'd survived 20 years in corporate law by being tougher than anyone else in the room, it felt like a lifeline. Alexis made it to her office before the composure finally cracked. She closed the door, sank into her chair, and stared at the stack of case studies on her desk. 5 years at McKinsey Sterling. 5 years of being twice as prepared, working twice as hard, and staying twice as quiet as her male colleagues. 5 years of swallowing comments like Calvin's and pretending they didn't cut. Her computer chimed with a message from Jordan Kim, her closest friend in the data analytics department. Coffee? You look like you need it. 20 minutes later, they sat in the small cafe on the building's ground floor, surrounded by the low hum of conversations and the hiss of espresso machines. Jordan pushed a steaming cup toward her, his dark eyes concerned behind wire-rimmed glasses. So, he said. Calvin's still an ass. Alexis managed a weak smile. Understatement of the year. What he set up there. Jordan shook his head. That was way over the line. Even for him. Was it, though? Alexis wrapped her hands around her cup, seeking warmth. I mean, no one said anything. No one even looked surprised. Jordan was quiet for a moment, studying her face. As a Korean American who'd faced his own share of workplace microaggressions, he understood the particular exhaustion that came from fighting battles no one else could see. You know what pisses me off the most, he said finally. Your analysis was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And he turned it into a conversation about your emotions. Maybe I should have kept quiet. Waited for someone else to. No. Jordan's voice was firm. Don't do that. Don't let him make you smaller. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. You want to know what I think? I think Calvin's scared. I think he looked at your presentation and realized you're smarter than he is, and that terrifies him. Alexis stared into her coffee. Smart doesn't matter if no one listens. Then make them listen. Something in his tone made her look up. Jordan was watching her with an intensity she'd rarely seen from him. He was usually the quiet one, the careful one, the one who solved problems from the shadows while other people took credit. The aerospace contract, he said quietly. It dropped this morning. $50 million. Biggest bid the firm's seen in 3 years. Alexis frowned. What about it? Calvin's positioning himself to lead the pitch. But the RFP is due in 2 weeks, and he's got the Hartford Insurance presentation next week. He's spread thin. Jordan paused, letting the implication sink in. Someone else could volunteer. Someone with the right analysis skills and client insight. Jordan. I'm serious. You want to prove him wrong about pressure? About women? About you? He reached across the table and tapped her notebook. Do what you do best. But do it bigger. Do it where everyone can see. That evening, Alexis sat in her Astoria apartment, laptop open on her kitchen table, staring at the internal memo about the aerospace contract. Meridian Aerospace Systems, the 6th largest defense contractor in the country, was looking for a consulting firm to overhaul their project management infrastructure. $50 million over 3 years. The kind of contract that could make careers. The kind of contract that Calvin assumed would be his. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. How was work, honey? Alexis stared at the message for a long moment, thinking about how to answer. How to explain that she'd been humiliated in front of the company's leadership. That she was considering a move that could either vindicate her or destroy her career entirely. Instead, she typed back, interesting day. Might have some big news soon. That's my girl, came the immediate response. Always knew you'd show them what you're made of. Alexis smiled despite herself. Elaine Ward had raised her daughter to believe that being underestimated was an advantage, not a weakness. That quiet determination could move mountains if applied in the right place at the right time. She opened a new document and began typing. Proposal to lead Meridian Aerospace consulting contract. The cursor blinked at her from the white page. Waiting. Outside her window, the city hummed with the energy of 8 million people pursuing their own ambitions, their own victories, their own revenge. Somewhere in Manhattan, Calvin Mercer was probably having dinner at an expensive restaurant, confident that his morning's work had put an uppity subordinate back in her place. He had no idea what he'd just unleashed. Alexis began to type, and with each word, she felt something shifting inside her chest. Not anger, she'd been angry before, and anger burned out. This was different. This was focus. This was purpose. This was the beginning of proving that some pressure only makes diamonds. She wouldn't walk away this time. She'd take on the impossible bid, and she'd win it in a way that would make Calvin Mercer's sexist assumptions choke on their own poison. The document grew, line by line, into something that looked remarkably like a battle plan. The Monday morning leadership meeting felt different. Alexis sat 3 seats down from Calvin, her proposal folder resting innocuously on the table beside her notepad. She'd rehearsed this moment dozens of times over the weekend, practicing her pitch in the mirror of her bathroom, timing her words to land with maximum impact. Calvin was mid-sentence, discussing resource allocation for the Meridian Aerospace bid. Natural fit for our corporate restructuring division. I've already sketched preliminary timelines, and I think we can deliver something truly exceptional. CEO Marcus Webb nodded thoughtfully. Timeline? 2 weeks for the initial pitch, then a phased rollout over 6 months once we secure the contract. Calvin's confidence filled the room like expensive cologne. I'll need to pull from several departments, but nothing we haven't handled before. Grace Hollander looked up from her legal pad. What's your team composition looking like? Senior partners from restructuring, a few analysts from Jordan's group for data support, maybe someone from client relations for the presentation polish. Calvin's gaze briefly swept past Alexis without acknowledgement. Standard configuration for this type of engagement. Actually, Alexis said, her voice cutting through the discussion like a clean blade, I'd like to propose an alternative approach. The room went still. Calvin's pen stopped moving across his notepad. Webb raised an eyebrow, his expression curious rather than annoyed. This was her window, the moment between surprise and dismissal when anything was possible. I'd like to lead the Meridian pitch. The silence stretched long enough for someone's phone to buzz twice on the table. Calvin recovered first, his laugh carrying just enough warmth to sound reasonable to anyone not listening carefully. Alexis, I appreciate the enthusiasm, but this is a $50 million contract. The complexity alone requires someone who understands their current pain points, she interrupted smoothly. Someone who spent the last 18 months analyzing exactly the type of inefficiencies Meridian is struggling with. She opened her folder and pulled out a single sheet. Their RFP mentions process optimization challenges in project timeline management. I've documented similar patterns across 12 of our current clients. Grace leaned forward slightly. You've been tracking this? For the past year and a half. Initially for my own research on client retention patterns. Alexis felt Calvin's attention sharpen like a predator sensing prey. But the applications are broader than I originally realized. Calvin's voice carried an edge now. Research is different from client management. This isn't about data analysis, it's about relationship building, stakeholder management, high-pressure presentations to C-suite executives. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Women can't handle pressure. The echo of Friday's humiliation. You're right, Alexis said, her tone deceptively agreeable. It is about pressure. It's about delivering results when the stakes are highest. She looked directly at Calvin. I'd welcome the opportunity to demonstrate those capabilities. Webb was watching this exchange with the focused attention of someone who'd built a consulting empire by reading between lines. What's your team structure, Alexis? Lean and specialized. Jordan Kim for data architecture, his pattern recognition work is unmatched. A junior analyst for fresh perspective and energy. Legal support from Grace's department for contract nuance. Alexis paused, letting her confidence settle over the room. And direct client interface managed by me. That's significantly smaller than standard protocol, Tom Richardson observed. Meridian's RFP specifically mentions wanting to work with a nimble, responsive team rather than a traditional consulting army, Alexis replied. They're frustrated with the bureaucratic approach they've been getting from other firms. Calvin's jaw tightened. How could you possibly know their specific frustrations? The RFP is fairly standard language. Alexis smiled, a careful, professional expression that concealed the satisfaction building in her chest. Because I called them. The room erupted in controlled chaos. Webb's eyebrows shot up. Grace set down her pen with deliberate precision. Calvin looked like he'd been slapped. You called Meridian directly? Richardson's voice carried a mixture of admiration and horror. I called their procurement office to clarify requirements in the RFP. Standard protocol for due diligence. Alexis kept her tone level, matter of fact. Danny Rhodes, their systems procurement lead, spent 20 minutes explaining their previous consulting experiences. Apparently, they've been frustrated with firms that promise customization but deliver cookie-cutter solutions. Grace was fighting a smile. And what did Mr. Rhodes say about our firm specifically? He said McKinsey Sterling has a strong reputation, but he hopes we understand that they're looking for substance over polish. His words, "We want someone who gets in the trenches with us, not someone who presents at us." Calvin's knuckles had gone white around his pen. "Unauthorized client contact is a serious breach of, I followed proper protocols," Alexis said calmly. "I cleared the call through client relations and documented everything appropriately." She pulled out another sheet from her folder. Sandrachan signed off on it Friday afternoon. Webb leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Calvin, you mentioned your timeline includes the Hartford Insurance presentation next week. That's a smaller engagement. I can manage both." "Can you?" Grace's voice was deceptively mild. "Because Hartford's been our client for 8 years. They might not appreciate feeling like they're getting leftover attention." The trap was closing, and everyone in the room could see it. Calvin had positioned himself as indispensable, but Alexis had just demonstrated that she'd done more client research in one phone call than his team had managed in initial planning. Webb drummed his fingers against the table, a sound that commanded attention. "Here's what we're going to do. Alexis, you'll lead the Meridian pitch. Calvin, you focus on Hartford. We'll compare approaches and see what works best going forward." Calvin's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, anger, calculation. "Marcus, with all due respect, putting an untested senior strategist in charge of our biggest potential contract is exactly the kind of innovative thinking that built this firm," Webb finished. "Alexis, you have 2 weeks. I want to see preliminary findings next Monday, full pitch the following Friday." "Understood." Alexis kept her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her system. "And Alexis?" Webb's tone carried a warning. "This is a big risk for all of us. Don't make me regret it." As the meeting broke up, Calvin approached her with the careful smile of a shark circling wounded prey. "Congratulations," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "I hope you know what you've gotten yourself into." "I do," she replied evenly. "Do you?" His smile didn't waver. "Because $50 million is a lot of money to lose because someone wanted to prove a point." "You're right," Alexis said, closing her folder with deliberate care. "It would be a shame to lose a contract because someone underestimated the team handling it." Calvin's smile finally slipped. "We'll see." As he walked away, Alexis felt the weight of what she'd just done settling over her shoulders. 2 weeks to prove that a woman could handle pressure. 2 weeks to vindicate 5 years of being overlooked, undermined, and dismissed. 2 weeks to either make her career or destroy it entirely. Grace appeared at her elbow, her expression carefully neutral. "Interesting strategy," she said quietly. "Think it'll work?" Grace's smile was razor-sharp. "I think Calvin Mercer just learned that underestimating people is a very expensive mistake." She paused at the door. "Don't prove him right, Ward." Alone in the conference room, Alexis looked out at the Manhattan skyline and felt something she hadn't experienced in years: the terrifying, exhilarating sensation of having nothing left to lose. She pulled out her phone and texted Jordan, "We're doing this. My office, 2 p.m. Bring coffee and your best ideas." The war had begun. Jordan arrived at Alexis's office carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd spent the morning reconsidering his life choices. "So," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk, "I heard you've officially lost your mind." News travels fast. Richardson's assistant told Sandra in client relations, who told half the building. Jordan set 1 cup in front of her and cradled the other like a lifeline. "Calvin's been in meetings all morning. Word is he's not happy." Alexis powered up her laptop and pulled out a legal pad covered in her weekend's planning notes. "Good. Happy Calvin is dangerous Calvin. Angry Calvin makes mistakes. Angry Calvin also has friends in high places and a talent for making people's lives miserable." Jordan leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Lex, I love that you're finally fighting back, but are you sure about this? $50 million is a lot of pressure?" She gave him a look. "Someone recently suggested that women can't handle pressure. I'm curious to test that theory." Jordan's smile was reluctant but genuine. "Okay. I'm in. What do you need?" For the next hour, they mapped out their approach. Jordan would dive deep into Meridian's data architecture, looking for inefficiencies and optimization opportunities. Alexis would focus on the human element, understanding their corporate culture, decision-making processes, and pain points that went beyond what appeared in official documentation. "We need a third person," Alexis said, reviewing their timeline. "Someone young, hungry, willing to work ridiculous hours." "Deshaun Parker," Jordan said immediately. "Kid's a genius, but he's stuck in data entry because his degree's from a state school instead of an Ivy. Calvin's team won't even look at him." "Perfect. Can you bring him in without raising flags?" "I'll tell him I need help with a special project." "Technically true." Jordan made a note. What about legal support? Grace said she'd provide backup. But how much can we really count on? Alexis had been wondering the same thing. Grace Hollander was brilliant, respected, and completely unreadable. Her intervention in the meeting had been crucial, but understanding her motivations was like trying to interpret smoke signals. I'll handle Grace. But we should also think about HR. Jordan nearly choked on his coffee. HR? Lex, Nina Blake would sell us out to Calvin in about 30 seconds if it protected her department's budget. Maybe. Or maybe she's tired of covering up for men like Calvin. Alexis pulled up Nina's internal profile on her screen. Look at her track record. She's handled 17 harassment complaints in the past 3 years. How many resulted in disciplinary action? Jordan peered at the screen. 3? That seems low. Suspiciously low. Alexis closed the file. I think Nina Blake knows exactly what kind of man Calvin is. The question is whether she's willing to do anything about it. Their planning was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Deshaun Parker stood in the doorway, lanky and eager, wearing a shirt that was slightly too big and a tie that was slightly too narrow. At 24, he had the earnest energy of someone who still believed that working hard and doing good work would be enough. Jordan said you needed some help with analysis? His voice carried a slight southern accent that he'd been trying to minimize since moving to New York. Come in, Deshaun. Close the door. Alexis gestured to the remaining chair. What Jordan means is that we're putting together a team for the Meridian Aerospace contract, and we'd like you to be part of it. Deshaun's eyes widened. The $50 million one? But you're brilliant, Jordan interrupted. Your pattern recognition work on the Carlyle project was better than anything the senior analysts produced. That's why we want you, Alexis added. Not despite your background, but because of it. Meridian wants fresh thinking, not the same recycled approaches they've been getting from other firms. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Deshaun looked between them, clearly struggling to process the opportunity. What would I be doing? System architecture analysis, Jordan said. Looking for inefficiencies, bottlenecks, optimization opportunities. The stuff you're naturally good at. And probably working 18-hour days for the next 2 weeks, Alexis added honestly. This isn't going to be easy. Deshaun's smile was radiant. When do we start? They spent the next 2 hours outlining responsibilities and timelines. Deshaun would focus on technical analysis while Jordan handled broader data patterns. Alexis would manage client relations and overall strategy. It was a lean team by McKinsey and Sterling standards, but that was exactly what Meridian claimed to want. As the afternoon wore on, Alexis found herself watching her teammates with growing respect. Jordan's quiet brilliance was something she'd known for years, but seeing him in full analytical mode reminded her why he'd been headhunted from MIT. Deshaun's enthusiasm was infectious, but beneath it lay a sharp mind that connected patterns others missed. Around 6 p.m., Jordan looked up from his laptop with the expression of someone who'd found something interesting. Lex, you need to see this. She moved to look over his shoulder at a spreadsheet filled with financial data. What am I looking at? Meridian's procurement history for the past 5 years. I pulled it from public filings and cross-referenced it with industry databases. Jordan highlighted several rows. See these consulting contracts? They average 18 months each, but none of them delivered their promised outcomes. How can you tell? Because they keep hiring new firms to fix the same problems. Jordan's finger traced down the screen. Project timeline optimization in 2019, process improvement in 2021, systems integration in 2023. Same issues, different consultants. Deshaun leaned forward. That's a pattern of failure. Either they're impossible to satisfy, or the firms they've been hiring don't understand their actual problems, Alexis finished. They're treating symptoms instead of causes. Exactly. And look at this. Jordan pulled up another screen. Their internal satisfaction surveys show consistent complaints about consultants who don't understand our culture and impose solutions without listening to our needs. Alexis felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle clicking into place. They don't want another cookie-cutter consulting approach. They want someone who'll take the time to understand how they actually work. Someone who calls them directly instead of relying on RFP language, Deshaun added with a grin. They worked until nearly 9 p.m., building a foundation of research that was more comprehensive than most firms managed in a month. As Deshaun packed up his notes, he paused at the door. Ms. Ward? Thank you for this opportunity. I won't let you down. Just call me Alexis. And Deshaun? I know you won't. After he left, Jordan lingered, gathering his materials slowly. You know Calvin's going to try to sabotage this, right? I'm counting on it. Why? Alexis looked out her office window at the lights of Manhattan stretching toward the horizon. Because angry people make mistakes. And when Calvin makes his move, we'll be ready for it. Jordan nodded slowly. What about Grace? You really think she'll back us? I think Grace Hollander has been waiting 20 years for someone to prove that different can be better. Alexis shut down her laptop and reached for her coat. Tomorrow I'm going to find out if I'm right. As they walked toward the elevators, Jordan asked, any regrets about volunteering for this? Alexis thought about Calvin's smug confidence. About 5 years of being overlooked, about the moment when she'd decided to stop being invisible. Ask me in 2 weeks. But privately, she knew the answer. For the first time in her career, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged, leading a team that believed in her, working on a challenge that would prove her worth, fighting a battle she finally had a chance to win. The only question was whether Calvin would let her get that far. Alexis arrived at the office Tuesday morning to find her computer running slower than usual. The login screen took 30 seconds longer than normal, and her email client crashed. Twice before finally loading. Annoying, but not catastrophic. She made a mental note to call IT and moved on with her day. By Thursday, the problems had escalated. Her presentation software corrupted a file Deshawn had spent 12 hours perfecting. Jordan's data analysis disappeared from the shared drive, forcing him to reconstruct 2 days' worth of work from backup notes. The conference room they'd reserved was suddenly double-booked, pushing their team meeting into a cramped office that smelled like stale coffee and broken dreams. This is not coincidence, Jordan muttered, hunched over his laptop in Alexis's office. It was past 8 p.m., and they were all running on caffeine and determination. Systems don't just randomly fail this consistently. Deshawn looked up from his corner of the desk, where he'd been rebuilding their technical analysis for the 3rd time. I tried to access the Meridian Research folder this afternoon. Got an error message saying I didn't have proper clearance. Since when do you need clearance for client research? Alexis pulled up the access logs on her screen. According to this, your permissions were revoked at 2:17 p.m. by Calvin. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Jordan closed his laptop with deliberate care. Okay. So we're playing that game. What game? Deshawn's voice carried the bewilderment of someone still learning how corporate warfare actually worked. Plausible deniability sabotage, Alexis explained. Nothing big enough to lodge a formal complaint about, but consistent enough to slow us down and create stress. Make us look disorganized, unreliable. Her phone buzzed with a text from Nina. Blake, can you stop by my office tomorrow at 9 a.m.? Need to discuss some performance review items. Alexis showed the message to Jordan, who swore quietly. Performance review? Now? Calvin's getting creative. Alexis pocketed her phone and looked at her team, exhausted, frustrated, but still working. He wants to put me on the defensive, make me spend time justifying my past performance instead of focusing on Meridian. Deshawn's jaw set with determination. What do? We work around him. Alexis stood and moved to the whiteboard, where they'd been mapping out their presentation structure. Jordan, can you create duplicate files on your personal server? Something Calvin can't touch? Already done. I've been backing up everything to an encrypted drive since Tuesday. Good. Deshawn, I want you to compile everything we have into a preliminary overview. Nothing fancy, just the core findings. If they try to corrupt our main presentation, we'll have something to fall back on. What about your meeting with Nina? Alexis considered the question. Nina Blake had been with the company for 12 years, steadily climbing from entry-level HR to executive level. She was smart, politically savvy, and utterly committed to protecting the company's interests. Under normal circumstances, she was the last person Alexis would want scrutinizing her performance. But these weren't normal circumstances. I think, Alexis said slowly, it's time to find out which side Nina's really on. The next morning, Alexis sat across from Nina in the HR executive office, surrounded by motivational posters about teamwork and excellence. Nina looked tired, her usually perfect makeup showing stress lines that no amount of concealer could hide. This is awkward, Nina began, shuffling through a file folder. I've been asked to conduct a preliminary performance review based on some concerns that have been raised about your recent approach to client relations. By Calvin. I can't discuss who initiated the request. Nina's voice was carefully neutral. But there are questions about unauthorized client contact, team formation outside normal protocols, and resource allocation without proper approval. Alexis had expected this. And what's your assessment? Nina was quiet for a long moment, studying Alexis's file. Officially? You've pushed boundaries in ways that could be problematic if they set precedent. And unofficially? Nina closed the file and looked directly at Alexis for the first time since she'd sat down. Unofficially? I've been doing this job for 12 years. I've seen a lot of concerns raised about employees who threaten the status quo. She paused. Most of those concerns came from men who felt their authority being questioned. The admission hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Alexis chose her words carefully. And how did those situations typically resolve? Depends on whether the employee had enough political capital to survive the pushback. Nina opened her desk drawer and pulled out another folder, thicker than the first. Or whether they had sufficient documentation to support their position. She slid the folder across the desk. Alexis opened it to find a collection of documents. Email chains, meeting notes, formal complaints, asterisk. All involving Calvin Mercer. What am I looking at? 12 complaints filed against Calvin in the past 3 years. Sexual harassment, discriminatory comments, workplace bullying. Nina's voice was flat, professional. All resolved through mediation or dismissed due to lack of corroborating evidence. Alexis flipped through the pages, recognizing names of colleagues who'd left the company or been transferred to other departments. Why are you showing me this? Because I'm tired of mediating the same problems with the same person. Nina leaned back in her chair. Because Calvin Mercer asked me to document performance issues that would justify removing you from the Meridian project. And will you? Nina smiled, a tired, bitter expression. I'll document that you followed proper protocols for client outreach, that your team formation was approved by senior leadership, and that any concerns about your performance appear to be motivated by factors unrelated to your actual work quality. Relief flooded through Alexis, followed immediately by suspicion. Why help me? Because in 12 years of HR work, I've learned to recognize when someone's being set up to fail. Nina stood and walked to her window, looking out at the city below. And because every time I've watched it happen, I've told myself there was nothing I could do. She turned back to Alexis. This time, maybe there is. That afternoon, Grace Hollander knocked on Alexis's office door with a stack of legal documents and an expression that suggested she'd found something interesting. Mind if I come in? Please. Alexis gestured to the chair across from her desk. What can I do for you? Grace set the documents on the desk with deliberate precision. I've been reviewing the Meridian contract terms, as requested. Standard consulting agreement, nothing unusual. She paused. Except for one small clause buried in the appendix. Alexis leaned forward. What kind of clause? Oversight requirements. Any consulting engagement over $40 million requires monthly financial audits by an independent third party. Grace's smile was sharp. Meridian takes very seriously the idea that their consultants might be financially creative. Meaning? Meaning that whoever lands this contract will have their books examined with a microscope. Every expense, every hour billed, every resource allocation. Grace's eyes glittered with something that looked like anticipation. Very inconvenient for someone whose past projects might not withstand that level of scrutiny. The implication hit Alexis like a physical blow. I think Calvin Mercer has been playing fast and loose with billing practices for years, and he's been protected by the fact that most clients don't audit consulting expenses beyond standard reviews. Grace collected her documents. I also think he's about to find out that Meridian Aerospace isn't most clients. After Grace left, Alexis sat in her office as the pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place. Calvin's desperation to keep her away from the Meridian contract. His increasingly aggressive sabotage efforts. His confidence that he could get her removed from the project. He wasn't just protecting his ego. He was protecting himself. Her computer chimed with an instant message from Jordan, you need to see something. Deshawn found an anomaly in the system architecture. She grabbed her notebook and headed for the data analysis lab, where Jordan and Deshawn were clustered around a large monitor displaying what looked like a complex flowchart. Show me, she said. Deshawn pointed to a section of the diagram. I was mapping Meridian's current system integration, trying to understand their process bottlenecks. But look at this data pathway. Alexis studied the screen. It looks like a loop. Exactly. The system is processing the same data sets multiple times, creating artificial delays and resource drain. Deshawn's excitement was palpable. But here's the interesting part, this isn't accidental. Someone designed it this way. Jordan pulled up another screen. We cross-referenced with their previous consulting contracts. Every firm that's worked on their systems integration has focused on optimization without questioning the underlying architecture. They've been treating the symptom instead of the disease, Alexis realized. And charging premium rates to manage problems that shouldn't exist. Gets better, Deshawn said. I traced the original system design. Guess which consulting firm installed it 4 years ago? Alexis felt her stomach drop. McKinsey Sterling. Project lead was Calvin Mercer. The room went quiet as the implications sank in. Calvin hadn't just been sabotaging Alexis's current project, he'd been sabotaging Meridian's systems for years, creating ongoing problems that justified continued consulting contracts. He's been farming them, Jordan said quietly. Installing problems so he could charge to fix them later. Alexis stared at the screen, her mind racing through the possibilities. This wasn't just about proving she could handle pressure anymore. This was about exposing a pattern of fraud that could destroy Calvin's career and potentially implicate the entire firm. Can you document this? She asked. Already started, Deshawn replied. Full technical analysis, with comparisons to industry standard architectures. Alexis felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. She could use this information to protect her team and secure the Meridian contract. But doing so would mean going to war with Calvin in a way that left no room for retreat. She thought about Nina's folder of complaints, about Grace's warning about financial audits, about 5 years of watching Calvin destroy careers with impunity. Document everything, she said finally. And prepare a clean system architecture proposal. We're not just going to win this contract. She looked at her team, brilliant, dedicated, fighting for their chance to prove themselves. We're going to make sure Meridian never has to deal with predatory consulting again. Marcus Webb's corner office felt like a courtroom. Alexis sat across from the CEO's massive desk, flanked by Calvin and Tom Richardson, while Grace observed from a chair near the window with the detached interest of someone watching a chess match between amateurs. Where do we stand? Webb's voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to receiving unvarnished truth, regardless of how uncomfortable it might be. Calvin spoke first, his tone measured and reasonable. The preliminary research phase has been challenging. Some coordination issues between departments, timeline concerns given the compressed schedule. He glanced at Alexis with what looked like sympathetic concern. I've offered to provide additional support resources, but Alexis has preferred to maintain her lean team approach. The subtext was clear, she's struggling, and she's too proud to accept help. Alexis? Webb's gaze shifted to her, expectant. We're on schedule, she said simply. The research has revealed some interesting opportunities that weren't apparent in the initial RFP. Such as? Alexis had debated how much to reveal in this meeting. Too little, and she'd appear unprepared. Too much, and Calvin would have time to develop countermeasures. She chose her words carefully. Meridian's previous consulting relationships have focused on process optimization without addressing underlying system architecture flaws. We've identified root causes that, if addressed, could deliver significantly greater value than traditional approaches. Calvin's expression remained neutral, but she caught a flicker of something, concern? Calculation? In his eyes. Can you be more specific? Richardson asked. I'd prefer to wait until the full presentation. Some of our findings have competitive implications that are best discussed in a more controlled setting. Webb leaned back in his chair, studying her. How controlled? Direct client presentation. Minimal internal review. Alexis felt Calvin tense beside her. Given the competitive nature of this bid, I think it's important to limit exposure of our strategic insights. That's highly irregular, Calvin interjected. Standard protocol requires internal review by senior leadership before any client presentation. Standard protocol also doesn't typically involve senior strategists leading $50 million bids, Grace observed from her corner. Perhaps irregular circumstances call for irregular approaches. Webb's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and stood. I need to take this call. Calvin, can you give me a status update on Hartford? For the next 10 minutes, Alexis listened to Calvin detail his progress on the Hartford insurance project. He was thorough, confident, hitting every milestone Webb cared about. It was a masterful display of competence that made her own compressed timeline look chaotic by comparison. When Webb finished his call, he looked between them with the expression of someone making a difficult calculation. Here's what we're going to do. Alexis, you'll present to the client as scheduled. But I want a preliminary review tomorrow afternoon. Just the key points, nothing that compromises competitive advantage. Of course. Calvin, I want you to sit in on that review. Provide perspective, ask questions. Collaborative approach. Alexis felt her stomach drop. Having Calvin in the review meeting was like having a saboteur examine her defenses. But Webb's tone left no room for argument. Understood, she said. As they filed out of Webb's office, Calvin fell into step beside her. Looking forward to tomorrow's review, he said quietly. Should be very educational. That afternoon, Alexis called Danny Rhodes at Meridian Aerospace. She'd been putting off direct client contact, knowing that Calvin would use any misstep against her. But with tomorrow's review looming, she needed to understand what really mattered to the client. Ms. Ward, Danny's voice carried the easy warmth of someone who preferred substance over ceremony. Good to hear from you. How's the analysis coming along? We've made some interesting discoveries. I was hoping we could discuss your priorities for the presentation next week. Shoot. The RFP focuses heavily on process optimization and timeline improvement. But our research suggests the real opportunity might be in system architecture redesign. There was a pause. You found something in the architecture? Alexis chose her words carefully, aware that this conversation could either make or break her pitch. We found patterns that suggest previous consulting approaches may have been treating symptoms rather than causes. If we're right, the potential value proposition is significantly larger than what's outlined in the RFP. How much larger? Potentially transformational. Instead of optimizing around existing inefficiencies, we could eliminate them entirely. Danny's interest was audible. Can you give me a preview of what you're thinking? Alexis looked around her office, making sure she was alone. Your current system processes data in loops that create artificial bottlenecks. It's not a design flaw, it's an intentional feature that serves no functional purpose but creates ongoing maintenance requirements. The silence stretched long enough that she wondered if the call had dropped. Danny? I'm here. His voice had changed, carrying an edge she hadn't heard before. Are you telling me someone deliberately designed inefficiencies into our system? I'm telling you that's what our analysis suggests. And I'm asking whether that's something Meridian would want to address. Hell yes, we'd want to address it. Danny's tone was grim. Ms. Ward, I'm going to be very direct with you. We've been frustrated with consulting firms that promise solutions but seem more interested in creating ongoing revenue streams than solving actual problems. Which is why you included language about wanting a nimble, responsive team. Exactly. We want someone who'll fix things and get out, not someone who'll fix them just enough to justify coming back next quarter. He paused. Can you prove what you're suggesting? We can document it thoroughly. Then that's what I want to see. Not another polished presentation about process improvement, evidence that you understand what's really broken and how to actually fix it. After the call, Alexis sat in her office feeling the weight of what she'd just committed to. Danny Rhodes wanted proof that previous consultants had been essentially defrauding his company. Providing that proof would require exposing Calvin's role in the original system design. There was no middle ground anymore. She was either going to destroy Calvin's career or he was going to destroy hers. Her computer chimed with a message from Jordan, emergency team meeting. Conference room B. Now. She found Jordan and Deshawn huddled around a laptop, both looking grim. What's the crisis? Jordan turned the screen toward her. Someone accessed our shared files remotely at 3:47 p.m. Downloaded everything. Calvin? Can't prove it, but the access came from a senior-level login. Deshawn pulled up another window. Here's the interesting part, they didn't just download our research. They copied our presentation templates, our formatting, even our slide transitions. Alexis stared at the access logs, feeling pieces of Calvin's strategy falling into place. He's not just trying to sabotage us. He's planning to steal our approach. Gets worse, Jordan said. I checked the internal calendar. Calvin scheduled a Hartford project review for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Guess who's attending? Who? Danny Rhodes. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow. Calvin was planning to present their research as his own, directly to the client, before her official presentation. By the time she got her chance to pitch, Danny would think she was recycling ideas he'd already heard. Can we prove he accessed our files? IT logs show the access, but they don't identify the specific user. Just that it came from Calvin's department. Jordan's expression was grim. Plausible deniability. Alexis felt the familiar burn of rage building in her chest, but this time it was different. Cleaner. More focused. Actually, she said slowly, this might be exactly what we need. Jordan looked at her like she'd lost her mind. How is Calvin stealing our work a good thing? Because if he presents our system architecture analysis tomorrow, he'll have to explain how he missed those flaws when he designed the original system 4 years ago. Alexis smiled, a cold, calculating expression. He can steal our research, but he can't steal our logic without implicating himself. Deshawn's eyes widened. You're going to let him hang himself. I'm going to give him all the rope he wants. At 8:45 a.m. the next morning, Alexis sat in the coffee shop across the street from McKinsey Sterling, watching Calvin enter the building with the confident stride of someone about to execute a perfect plan. Her laptop was open to a video call with Danny Rhodes, who'd agreed to take her emergency consultation call at the last minute. "I appreciate you making time for this," she said, adjusting her earpiece. "I wanted to give you a heads up about something that might come up in other presentations you're seeing." Danny's face on the screen looked curious but cautious. "What kind of something?" "We discovered a critical flaw in your current system architecture. A designed inefficiency that's been costing you millions in operational overhead." Alexis had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, but her heart was still racing. The problem is, fixing it would require acknowledging that whoever installed the original system either made a massive error or deliberately created the problem. "You're talking about the data processing loops you mentioned yesterday?" "Exactly. But Danny, I need you to understand, this isn't just a technical issue. It's potentially a legal one. If we're right about the deliberate nature of the design, you might have grounds for recovering damages from the original consulting firm." Danny's expression sharpened. "How sure are you about this?" 95%. "But I wanted to warn you because you might hear alternative explanations from other firms. Claims that the loops are necessary for data integrity, or that removing them would create security vulnerabilities." Alexis paused, letting the implication sink in. "Those explanations would be false, but they might sound plausible if you weren't expecting them. And if someone tried to feed me that kind of explanation, I'd suggest asking them to document exactly why those loops are necessary, and whether they had any role in the original system design." Alexis smiled. Just to avoid any conflicts of interest. 20 minutes later, she was sitting in Webb's conference room, watching Calvin set up his presentation with the smooth confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Jordan and Deshawn flanked her, their expressions carefully neutral despite the tension crackling between them. "Since we're all here," Calvin began, "I thought it might be useful to share some insights from the Hartford project that could apply to the Meridian engagement." He clicked to his first slide, System Architecture Optimization, Identifying Hidden Inefficiencies. Alexis had to admire his audacity. He was presenting their research almost word for word, complete with the technical diagrams Deshawn had spent days perfecting. The only differences were cosmetic: new fonts, different color schemes, the McKinsey and Sterling logo prominently displayed. "As you can see," Calvin continued, "modern enterprise systems often contain legacy elements that create unnecessary processing overhead. In Meridian's case, we've identified several data processing loops that appear to serve no functional purpose." Grace leaned forward from her corner. "How did you identify these loops, Calvin?" "Standard architecture analysis. We mapped their current system integration and found several anomalies." Calvin's confidence never wavered. "The key insight is that these loops aren't accidents, they're deliberate design choices that create ongoing maintenance requirements." "Interesting," Webb said. "And you're certain these loops are unnecessary?" "Absolutely. Removing them would eliminate approximately 40% of their current processing overhead while improving system responsiveness by an estimated 60%. Deshawn shifted in his chair. Alexis caught his eye and gave him a subtle shake of the head. "Not yet." Calvin advanced to his next slide, Implementation Strategy, Phased Elimination of System Redundancies. For 20 minutes, he presented their work as his own, fielding questions with practiced ease. It was a masterful performance that would have been career-ending for Alexis if not for one crucial detail: Calvin had no idea what he was really saying. "This is impressive work," Richardson said as Calvin wrapped up. "Have you run this past the client?" "Actually," Calvin smiled, "I have a call with Danny Rhodes in about 15 minutes, asterisk. I wanted to get leadership feedback first." Alexis felt the trap closing. "Calvin, can I ask you something about the system architecture?" "Of course. These data processing loops you've identified, when were they first implemented?" Calvin paused, his first sign of uncertainty. "I'd have to check the implementation timeline. Because I'm curious about something." Alexis pulled out her own laptop and connected it to the conference room display. According to Meridian's procurement records, their current system architecture was designed by McKinsey and Sterling in 2019. She clicked to a document showing the original contract details. Calvin's name was listed as project lead. The room went silent. Calvin's face cycled through several expressions: confusion, realization, panic. "So my question is," Alexis continued, her voice perfectly level, "if these loops are unnecessary design flaws, how did they end up in a system that we designed?" Calvin's mouth opened and closed without sound. Grace was fighting a smile. Webb's expression had gone from interested to cold. "Either," Alexis said, advancing to her next slide, "our firm made a massive error that's been costing our client Millions of dollars for 4 years, or someone deliberately designed inefficiencies into their system to create ongoing consulting opportunities. She looked directly at Calvin. Which explanation would you prefer to give to Danny Rhodes? Calvin finally found his voice. There must be some mistake. I need to review the original specifications, I have them here. Jordan stood and handed Webb a thick folder. Complete technical documentation from the 2019 implementation, including Calvin's design notes and approval signatures. Webb opened the folder and began reading, his expression growing darker with each page. Calvin, this documentation shows explicit decisions to implement what you're now calling unnecessary loops. Your notes describe them as ongoing maintenance touchpoints and revenue optimization features. The euphemisms hung in the air like poison gas. Calvin had documented his own fraud in corporate doublespeak, and now that documentation was being read aloud in front of the company's senior leadership. I can explain, Calvin started. Please do, Grace said, her voice carrying the sharp interest of someone who specialized in corporate liability. Because from a legal perspective, this looks like intentional sabotage of client systems for financial gain. Calvin's phone buzzed. Everyone in the room could see Danny Rhodes' name on the caller ID. You should probably take that, Alexis said helpfully. I'm sure Danny is eager to hear your explanation for why you've been charging him to fix problems you created. Calvin stared at the phone like it was a snake. He couldn't answer without explaining why he was calling about system flaws he'd designed himself. He couldn't ignore it without looking incompetent in front of Webb. The phone stopped buzzing. 30 seconds later, it buzzed again. I think, Webb said quietly, we need to have a different conversation. Grace, my office in 10 minutes. Calvin, don't leave the building. As the meeting broke up, Calvin approached Alexis with the desperate energy of someone watching their career collapse in real time. You don't understand what you've done, he said, his voice low and urgent. This will destroy the firm's reputation. Webb will throw you under the bus to protect the company. Maybe, Alexis replied. Or maybe Webb will appreciate having a team that solves problems instead of creating them. Calvin's mask finally slipped completely. You think this is over? You think exposing me protects you? His smile was ugly. I've been documenting your performance issues for weeks. Missed deadlines, unauthorized client contact, team dysfunction. When this blows up, guess who's going to take the blame? The person who actually committed fraud? Alexis suggested. Or the person who exposed it? Calvin's laugh was bitter. You really don't know how this works, do you? Companies don't reward whistleblowers. They eliminate problems. And right now, you're the biggest problem McKinsey and Sterling has. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Enjoy your moment of victory, Alexis. Because it's going to be very, very short. As he walked away, Alexis felt the weight of what she'd unleashed settling over her shoulders. Calvin was right about one thing, companies protected themselves. Above all else. And if Webb decided that the safest approach was to sacrifice both Calvin and the person who'd exposed him, she could find herself unemployed by the end of the week. But as she looked at Jordan and Deshawn, brilliant, loyal, finally getting the recognition they deserved, she realized she didn't care. Some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the cost. Her phone buzzed with a text from Danny Rhodes. Tried to reach your colleague about the system architecture. Can we move up our meeting? I have some urgent questions. Alexis smiled and typed back, absolutely. How's this afternoon? The real presentation was about to begin. Nina Blake's office felt different at 7 p.m. The motivational posters seemed less optimistic in the harsh fluorescent light, and the stack of manila folders on her desk looked more like evidence than employee files. Nina sat across from Alexis, her usually perfect composure showing cracks of exhaustion and something that looked like relief. I want to be very clear about what I'm doing here, Nina said, her voice steady despite the weight of the documents between them. This conversation never happened. These files were never in your possession. Understood. Nina opened the first folder. Calvin Mercer. Formal complaints filed between 2019 and present. She spread the documents across her desk like cards. Sexual harassment from Rebecca Chen, now working at Goldman Sachs. Discriminatory comments witnessed by multiple staff members. Workplace bullying documented by 3 separate interns who were subsequently transferred or terminated. Alexis scanned the complaints, recognizing names and incidents she'd heard whispered about in break rooms. Why weren't these acted on? Lack of corroborating evidence. Witnesses who suddenly became unavailable. Complainants who withdrew their statements after private meetings with Calvin. Nina's tone was flat, professional, but anger simmered beneath the surface. The pattern was clear, but the documentation was always just insufficient for formal discipline. She opened another folder. Financial irregularities. Project billing that consistently ran over budget without client approval. Resource allocation that favored Calvin's projects over others with similar priority levels. Nina pulled out a spreadsheet. In the past 3 years, Calvin's division has had the highest profit margins and the lowest client satisfaction scores. How is that possible? When you're billing clients for problems you created, profit margins tend to be very healthy. Nina's smile was bitter. Client satisfaction suffers when you're more interested in extending contracts than solving problems. Alexis felt pieces of a larger picture falling into place. The Meridian loops weren't an isolated incident. Calvin's been running the same playbook for years. Install systems with built-in maintenance requirements, then charge premium rates. To manage those requirements, Nina pulled out another document. Hartford Insurance, Carlisle Manufacturing, Bennett and Associates, all showing the same pattern of ongoing consulting needs that never quite get resolved. Why come forward now? Nina was quiet for a long moment, staring at the stack of evidence she'd been collecting for years. Because this morning, Calvin came to my office and asked me to document performance issues that would justify removing you from the Meridian project. And when I asked him to be specific about those issues, he told me that women like you were emotional and couldn't handle the pressure of major client relationships. Nina's voice hardened. He said it was my job to protect the company from employees who might embarrass us in front of important clients. Alexis felt a familiar burn of anger, but also something else, a recognition of shared experience. How many times have you had conversations like that? Too many. For 12 years, I've been told that my job is to manage difficult employees and protect valuable ones. The difficult ones are usually women or minorities who ask inconvenient questions. The valuable ones are usually men who generate revenue, regardless of how they treat people. Nina stood and walked to her window, looking out at the city lights. I became an HR executive because I wanted to protect people. Instead, I've spent my career protecting predators. What changes now? Now I document the truth. Nina turned back to Alexis. Calvin's pattern of behavior, his financial irregularities, his systematic exploitation of clients. She gestured to the folders. And I make sure the right people see it. Grace? Grace, Webb, the board if necessary. Nina's expression was resolute. Calvin asked me to destroy your career to protect his. Instead, I'm going to destroy his to protect everyone else he might harm. An hour later, Alexis sat in Grace Hollander's office, watching the chief legal officer review Nina's documentation with the focused intensity of someone building a case. This is substantial, Grace said finally. Enough to justify immediate suspension pending investigation. What about the Meridian contract? That depends on how much damage Calvin's already done. Grace closed the folder and looked directly at Alexis. Nina mentioned that Calvin scheduled a call with Danny Rhodes this morning. How did that go? Alexis smiled. About as well as you'd expect for someone trying to explain why he's been charging a client to fix problems he created. Danny figured it out? Danny's not stupid. When Calvin couldn't explain why those system loops were necessary, Danny started asking harder questions. Alexis pulled out her phone and showed Grace a text from that afternoon. Need to discuss serious concerns about previous consulting work. Can we meet ASAP? Grace's smile was sharp. Meridian's looking for answers. And we have them. The question is whether Webb will let us provide them. Webb's primary concern is protecting the firm. If Calvin's fraud becomes public, it could destroy our reputation with every major client. Grace leaned back in her chair, calculating. But if we handle this correctly, it could also position us as the firm that cleaned house and prioritized client interests over short-term profits. Which narrative wins? The one that's best for business. Grace stood and gathered the documents. I'm calling a board meeting for tomorrow morning. Emergency session to address client relationship irregularities. Will Calvin be there? Calvin will be suspended as of 9 a.m. tomorrow. His access to company systems will be revoked, and all his client relationships will be transferred to other senior staff. Grace paused at the door. Including Meridian. To who? Grace's smile was almost maternal. To the senior strategist who uncovered the fraud and prevented a potential lawsuit. That night, Alexis called her mother from her apartment kitchen. Staring out at the Queen's skyline while Elaine Ward's voice carried across the phone line with the warmth of someone who'd spent 30 years nursing people through their worst moments. You sound different, honey, her mother said. Tired, but stronger somehow. It's been a complicated week. The good kind of complicated or the bad kind? Alexis thought about Calvin's threats, about the risk she'd taken in exposing Him, about the career she might have destroyed to save her integrity. I'm not sure yet. Want to talk about it? For the next hour, Alexis found herself telling her mother everything: Calvin's sexist comments, the Meridian contract, the system fraud, Nina's courage in coming forward. Her mother listened without judgment, asking occasional questions that helped clarify Alexis's own thinking. So this Calvin person, Elaine said finally, he's been stealing from his clients for years? Essentially, yes. And you stopped him? I exposed him. Whether that stops him depends on what the company does next. Elaine was quiet for a moment. You know what I'm proud of? What? Not that you won. I mean, I'm proud of that too, but that's not the important part. Her mother's voice carried the certainty of someone who'd raised a daughter to know the difference between right and wrong. I'm proud that when you had to choose between keeping quiet and speaking up, you spoke up. Even when it was dangerous. It might cost me my job. Jobs come and go, sweetheart. But being able to look at yourself in the mirror? That's permanent. After the call, Alexis sat in her kitchen with a cup of tea, thinking about the woman who'd raised her. Elaine Ward had worked 3 jobs to put her daughter through college, had never owned a car that wasn't at least 10 years old, had sacrificed her own dreams to make Alexis's possible. Tomorrow, Alexis would find out whether that sacrifice had been worth it. Whether speaking truth to power was enough to change a system built on silence and complicity. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jordan: emergency board meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. Rumor is Calvin's being suspended. Another buzz, this one from Deshawn: Danny Rhodes wants to meet with our team tomorrow afternoon. Says he has a proposition. A third buzz, from Grace: be prepared to present the real Meridian proposal tomorrow. Full technical analysis, no holds barred. Alexis finished her tea and opened her laptop. If tomorrow was going to be the day that defined the rest of her career, she was going to meet it with the best presentation she'd ever created. Outside her window, New York City hummed with the energy of 8 million people pursuing their own dreams of success, redemption, and justice. Tomorrow, she'd find out which of those dreams would survive the light of day. But tonight, for the first time in years, Alexis Ward felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The Meridian Aerospace Systems headquarters in Midtown Manhattan looked like it had been designed by someone who believed that glass and steel could inspire confidence in military contractors. Alexis stood in the lobby at 1:45 p.m., her team flanking her like soldiers preparing for battle, while Danny Rhodes approached with the measured stride of someone who'd spent the morning asking very pointed questions about consulting ethics. Ms. Ward, Danny's handshake was firm, his expression unreadable. Thank you for making time on short notice. Of course. Danny, this is Jordan Kim, our data architecture specialist, and Deshawn Parker, our systems analyst. Danny nodded to each of them, then gestured toward the elevator bank. Conference rooms on the 32nd floor. I should mention, we've invited a few additional stakeholders to sit in on this presentation. As they rode up, Alexis caught Jordan's eye in the reflection of the elevator doors. Additional stakeholders could mean anything from interested executives to legal counsel. Given the morning's events at McKinsey Sterling, she suspected the latter. The conference room was larger than she'd expected, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of Central Park. Around the oval table sat 6 people: Danny, 2 executives she recognized from Meridian's website, and 3 others in suits that screamed corporate legal. Before we begin, Danny said as they settled into their chairs, I want to address some concerns that have come to our attention regarding McKinsey Sterling's previous work with Meridian. Alexis felt her stomach tighten. What kind of concerns? The kind that involved deliberate system sabotage and fraudulent billing practices. Danny's tone was conversational, but his eyes were hard. This morning, your colleague Calvin Mercer called to discuss system architecture improvements. When we asked him to explain why these improvements were necessary, his answers raised some very troubling questions. One of the legal team spoke up. Specifically, questions about whether the inefficiencies in our current system were intentionally designed to create ongoing maintenance contracts. Alexis glanced at Jordan, who gave her a subtle nod. This was it, the moment when they either vindicated themselves or went down with Calvin's ship. Danny, she said carefully, what exactly did Calvin tell you? He presented an analysis identifying data processing loops in our system architecture that serve no functional purpose. When we asked him how those loops got there, he claimed they were legacy elements from our previous IT vendor. Danny's smile was cold. The problem is, we designed those systems with McKinsey Sterling in 2019. Calvin was the project lead. The silence in the room was deafening. Alexis could feel the weight of 6 pairs of eyes evaluating her, trying to determine whether she was complicit in Calvin's fraud or a potential solution to it. I understand your concerns, she said finally. And I think our analysis will address them directly. She stood and connected her laptop to the conference room display. But first, I want to be completely transparent about what we discovered and how we discovered it. For the next hour, Alexis walked them through their research with surgical precision. Jordan presented the technical analysis showing how the data loops artificially inflated processing times. Deshawn demonstrated how removing those loops would improve system efficiency by 60% while reducing maintenance requirements by 40%. But the crucial moment came when Alexis displayed the original 2019 system design documentation. These are Calvin Mercer's design notes from your original system implementation, she said, highlighting key passages. He explicitly describes the data loops as revenue optimization features and ongoing maintenance touchpoints. One of the Meridian executives leaned forward. Are you saying he deliberately sabotaged our system? I'm saying the evidence suggests that someone designed inefficiencies into your system to create a dependable stream of consulting revenue. Alexis clicked to her next slide. The question is what you want to do about it. Danny was reading through the documentation with the focused attention of someone who'd spent 4 years being frustrated by system problems that should have been fixable. How much has this cost us? Jordan had prepared for this question. Based on your operational overhead data, approximately $12. $8 million in unnecessary processing costs and system downtime over the past 4 years. The room went quiet. Danny looked up from the documents, his expression somewhere between anger and grim satisfaction. And how much would it cost to fix? That depends on what you mean by fix, Deshawn said, his nervousness finally giving way to technical enthusiasm. If you want to just remove the problem loops, we could do that in about 6 weeks for minimal cost. But, Alexis continued, if you want to rebuild your system architecture from the ground up, eliminate not just the intentional flaws but all the legacy inefficiencies, we're talking about a complete transformation that would position you ahead of every competitor in the industry. She clicked to her final presentation slide, Meridian Aerospace Systems, next-generation infrastructure for next-generation defense. For the next 30 minutes, they outlined a comprehensive system overhaul that went far beyond fixing Calvin's sabotage. They proposed a modular architecture that would allow rapid integration of new technologies, predictive maintenance protocols that would eliminate unplanned downtime, and security features that would exceed Pentagon requirements. The timeline is 18 months, Alexis concluded. The cost is within your original budget parameters. And the result would be a system architecture that's not just more efficient than what you have now, but more advanced than anything your competitors are using. Danny was quiet for a long moment, studying the technical specifications. This is significantly more ambitious than what was outlined in our original RFP. Because your original RFP was designed around managing existing problems, not eliminating them, Jordan said. We're proposing to solve the problems you know about and the ones you haven't discovered yet. One of the legal team spoke up. What about accountability for the previous system design? If McKinsey Sterling defrauded us, we want damages recovered. Alexis had expected this question and had discussed it with Grace at length. Our understanding is that McKinsey Sterling is conducting an internal investigation into the 2019 project. Any irregularities will be addressed through appropriate channels. Meaning Calvin Mercer was suspended this morning pending a full review of his client relationships. Alexis looked directly at Danny. Our firm takes client trust very seriously. When we discover problems, we fix them. Danny's smile was the first genuinely warm expression she'd seen from him all day. So you're not just offering to clean up someone else's mess. You're taking responsibility for it. We're taking responsibility for making sure it never happens again. The Meridian team huddled in the corner of the conference room for 10 minutes, their conversation too quiet for Alexis to overhear. She used the time to review her notes and try to gauge the room's energy. The legal team looked satisfied with the accountability measures. The executives seemed impressed by the scope of the proposal. Danny kept glancing at the technical specifications with the expression of someone who'd found exactly what he'd been looking for. When they returned to the table, Danny was carrying a folder that looked suspiciously like a contract. Ms. Ward, he said, Meridian Aerospace Systems would like to offer McKinsey Sterling the consulting contract for complete system architecture redesign, as outlined in your presentation. Alexis felt her heart stop. The full scope? Full scope. 18-month timeline. $50 million budget. Danny's smile was now genuinely warm. With one condition. Which is? We want you personally to lead the engagement. Not Calvin Mercer, not whoever else your firm might assign. You, Jordan, and Deshawn, with whatever additional support you need. Alexis looked at her team, Jordan fighting a grin, Deshawn looking like he might faint from excitement, and felt something she'd never experienced in her corporate career, the absolute certainty that she'd earned this moment. "We accept," she said. As they shook hands around the table, Danny leaned close enough for only her to hear. "Ms. Ward, in 15 years of working with consulting firms, I've never seen a team willing to expose their own company's mistakes to do right by a client. That kind of integrity is exactly what we've been looking for." 40 minutes later, they stood on the sidewalk outside Meridian's building, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across Manhattan. Jordan was clutching a signed copy of the contract like it might disappear. Deshawn was talking rapidly into his phone, probably calling his parents with the news. Alexis's phone buzzed with a text from Grace. "Board meeting concluded. Calvin's termination effective immediately. Webb wants to see you first thing tomorrow morning. Bring champagne." Another buzz, this one from Nina. "Heard the news about Meridian. Congratulations. P.S. Calvin cleaned out his office this afternoon. Security escort and everything." A third buzz, from her mother. "Whatever happened today, I'm proud of you." Alexis looked up at the Meridian building, then at her team, then at the city stretching out around them in all directions. Somewhere in Manhattan, Calvin Mercer was probably calling his lawyer and updating his resume. Somewhere else, Grace Hollander was preparing talking points about corporate accountability and client-focused values. But here, on this sidewalk, with a $50 million contract in Jordan's hands and the satisfaction of a job well done settling over her shoulders, Alexis Ward finally understood what it felt like to win on her own terms. "So," Jordan said, grinning, "what do we do now?" Alexis smiled back. "Now we get to work. We have a company to transform and a system to build." She looked at Deshawn, who was finishing his phone call with tears in his eyes. "And we have some careers to launch." The city hummed around them with the energy of possibility, and for the first time in her professional life, Alexis felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Marcus Webb's office felt different at 9 a.m. on a Friday morning. The usual corporate confidence had been replaced by something more cautious, more calculating. Webb sat behind his massive desk, flanked by Grace Hollander and two executives Alexis didn't recognize, both wearing the carefully neutral expressions of people brought in to manage crisis communications. "Sit," Webb said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "We need to discuss yesterday's events." Alexis settled into the chair, her copy of the Meridian contract resting in her lap like armor. "Which events specifically?" "Let's start with Calvin Mercer's termination and work our way up to the $50 million contract you secured without prior authorization." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Alexis had expected this conversation, had rehearsed various versions of it, but Webb's tone was harder to read than she'd anticipated. "The contract was secured within the parameters of my original assignment," she said carefully. "You asked me to lead the Meridian pitch. That's what I did." "You did considerably more than that." One of the unknown executives, a thin man with silver hair and the predatory stillness of corporate legal, leaned forward. "You exposed internal misconduct, documented fraud, and provided client testimony that has resulted in potential liability for the firm." Grace's voice cut through the tension. "She also prevented a lawsuit that could have cost us significantly more than Calvin's termination." "Did she?" Silverhair's smile was cold. "Or did she create a legal exposure that didn't exist before she started digging into past client relationships?" Alexis felt the familiar burn of institutional injustice, the moment when doing the right thing became a liability in a system designed to protect wrongdoing. "Are you suggesting I should have stayed quiet about the fraud?" "I'm suggesting," Webb said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years in corporate leadership, that there were ways to handle this situation that didn't result in front-page exposure for the firm. He slid a tablet across the desk. The Wall Street Journal's homepage displayed a headline that made Alexis's stomach drop: "McKinsey Sterling fires senior director after client fraud allegations." "The story broke an hour ago," Webb continued. "Meridian's legal team apparently felt compelled to make a public statement about recovering damages from fraudulent consulting practices." Alexis scanned the article, her heart sinking with each paragraph. The piece laid out Calvin's fraudulent billing practices in detail, quoted Danny Rhodes extensively about predatory consulting relationships, and positioned McKinsey and Sterling as a firm struggling to contain internal corruption. "This is a disaster," the second unknown executive said. 3 clients have already called requesting reviews of their consulting contracts. Our stock price is down 8% in pre-market trading." "On the other hand," Grace said, her tone deceptively mild, "we've also received 4 inquiries from potential new clients who are specifically interested in working with the team that cleaned house and prioritized client interests." She pulled out her own folder, including 2 Fortune 500 companies that specifically requested Alexis Ward's team for their consulting needs. The silver-haired executive looked skeptical. Based on what? Based on a LinkedIn post that Danny Rhodes published this morning praising McKinsey and Sterling for demonstrating the kind of ethical leadership that's rare in corporate consulting. Grace's smile was sharp. He specifically mentioned being impressed by consultants willing to expose fraud within their own firm to protect client interests. Webb took back the tablet and scrolled through what appeared to be a longer analysis. What's our legal exposure? Minimal, Grace replied. Calvin's employment contract includes standard fraud provisions that void any severance or non-compete agreements. His documentation of the fraudulent practices actually protects us from claims of institutional knowledge. Meaning? Calvin was stupid enough to document his fraud in company files, which proves it was individual misconduct rather than corporate policy. Grace's expression was satisfied. We're the victims here, not the perpetrators. The preliminary research phase has been challenging. Some coordination issues between departments, timeline concerns given the compressed schedule. He glanced at Alexis with what looked like sympathetic concern. I've offered to provide additional support resources, but Alexis has preferred to maintain her lean team approach. The subtext was clear: she's struggling, and she's too proud to accept help. Alexis? Webb's gaze shifted to her, expectant. We're on schedule, she said simply. The research has revealed some interesting opportunities that weren't apparent in the initial RFP. Such as? Alexis had debated how much to reveal in this meeting. Too little, and she'd appear unprepared. Too much, and Calvin would have time to develop countermeasures. She chose her words carefully. Meridian's previous consulting relationships have focused on process optimization without addressing underlying system architecture flaws. We've identified root causes that, if addressed, could deliver significantly greater value than traditional approaches. Calvin's expression remained neutral, but she caught a flicker of something: concern? Calculation? In his eyes. Can you be more specific? Richardson asked. I'd prefer to wait until the full presentation. Some of our findings have competitive implications that are best discussed in a more controlled setting. Webb leaned back in his chair, studying her. How controlled? Direct client presentation. Minimal internal review. Alexis felt Calvin tense beside her. Given the competitive nature of this bid, I think it's important to limit exposure of our strategic insights. That's highly irregular, Calvin interjected. Standard protocol requires internal review by senior leadership before any client presentation. Standard protocol also doesn't typically involve senior strategists leading $50 million bids, Grace observed from her corner. Perhaps irregular circumstances call for irregular approaches. Webb's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and stood. I need to take this call. Calvin, can you give me a status update on Hartford? For the next 10 minutes, Alexis listened to Calvin detail his progress on the Hartford insurance project. He was thorough, confident, hitting every milestone Webb cared about. It was a masterful display of competence that made her own compressed timeline look chaotic by comparison. When Webb finished his call, he looked between them with the expression of someone making a difficult calculation. Here's what we're going to do. Alexis, you'll present to the client as scheduled. But I want a preliminary review tomorrow afternoon. Just the key points, nothing that compromises competitive advantage. Of course. Calvin, I want you to sit in on that review. Provide perspective, ask questions. Collaborative approach. Alexis felt her stomach drop. Having Calvin in the review meeting was like having a saboteur examine her defenses. But Webb's tone left no room for argument. Understood, she said. As they filed out of Webb's office, Calvin fell into step beside her. Looking forward to tomorrow's review, he said quietly. Should be very educational. That afternoon, Alexis called Danny Rhodes at Meridian Aerospace. She'd been putting off direct client contact, knowing that Calvin would use any misstep against her. But with tomorrow's review looming, she needed to understand what really mattered to the client. Ms. Ward, Danny's voice carried the easy warmth of someone who preferred substance over ceremony. Good to hear from you. How's the analysis coming along? We've made some interesting discoveries. I was hoping we could discuss your priorities for the presentation next week. Shoot. The RFP focuses heavily on process optimization and timeline improvement. But our research suggests the real opportunity might be in system architecture redesign. There was a pause. You found something in the architecture? Alexis chose her words carefully, aware that this conversation could either make or break her pitch. We found patterns that suggest previous consulting approaches may have been treating symptoms rather than causes. If we're right, the potential value proposition is significantly larger than what's outlined in the RFP. How much larger? Potentially transformational. Instead of optimizing around existing inefficiencies, we could eliminate them entirely. Danny's interest was audible. Can you give me a preview of what you're thinking? Alexis looked around her office, making sure she was alone. Your current system processes data in loops that create artificial bottlenecks. It's not a design flaw, it's an intentional feature that serves no functional purpose but creates ongoing maintenance requirements. The silence stretched long enough that she wondered if the call had dropped. Danny? I'm here. His voice had changed, carrying an edge she hadn't heard before. Are you telling me someone deliberately designed inefficiencies into our system? I'm telling you that's what our analysis suggests. And I'm asking whether that's something Meridian would want to address. Hell yes, we'd want to address it. Danny's tone was grim. Ms. Ward, I'm going to be very direct with you. We've been frustrated with consulting firms that promise solutions but seem more interested in creating ongoing revenue streams than solving actual problems. Which is why you included language about wanting a nimble, responsive team. Exactly. We want someone who'll fix things and get out, not someone who'll fix them just enough to justify coming back next quarter. He paused. Can you prove what you're suggesting? We can document it thoroughly. Then that's what I want to see. Not another polished presentation about process improvement, evidence that you understand what's really broken and how to actually fix it. After the call, Alexis sat in her office feeling the weight of what she'd just committed to. Danny Rhodes wanted proof that previous consultants had been essentially defrauding his company. Providing that proof would require exposing Calvin's role in the original system design. There was no middle ground anymore. She was either going to destroy Calvin's career or he was going to destroy hers. Her computer chimed with a message from Jordan, emergency team meeting. Conference room B. Now. She found Jordan and Deshawn huddled around a laptop, both looking grim. What's the crisis? Jordan turned the screen toward her. Someone accessed our shared files remotely at 3:47 p.m. Downloaded everything. Calvin? Can't prove it, but the access came from a senior-level login. Deshawn pulled up another window. Here's the interesting part, they didn't just download our research. They copied our presentation templates, our formatting, even our slide transitions. Alexis stared at the access logs, feeling pieces of Calvin's strategy falling into place. He's not just trying to sabotage us. He's planning to steal our approach. Gets worse, Jordan said. I checked the internal calendar. Calvin scheduled a Hartford project review for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Guess who's attending? Who? Danny Rhodes. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow. Calvin was planning to present their research as his own, directly to the client, before her official presentation. By the time she got her chance to pitch, Danny would think she was recycling ideas he'd already heard. Can we prove he accessed our files? IT logs show the access, but they don't identify the specific user. Just that it came from Calvin's department. Jordan's expression was grim. Plausible deniability. Alexis felt the familiar burn of rage building in her chest, but this time it was different. Cleaner. More focused. Actually, she said slowly, this might be exactly what we need. Jordan looked at her like she'd lost her mind. How is Calvin stealing our work a good thing? Because if he presents our system architecture analysis tomorrow, he'll have to explain how he missed those flaws when he designed the original system 4 years ago. Alexis smiled, a cold, calculating expression. He can steal our research, but he can't steal our logic without implicating himself. Deshawn's eyes widened. You're going to let him hang himself. I'm going to give him all the rope he wants. At 8:45 a.m. the next morning, Alexis sat in the coffee shop across the street from McKinsey Sterling, watching Calvin enter the building with the confident stride of someone about to execute a perfect plan. Her laptop was open to a video call with Danny Rhodes, who'd agreed to take her emergency consultation call at the last minute. I appreciate you making time for this, she said, adjusting her earpiece. I wanted to give you a heads up about something that might come up in other presentations you're seeing. Danny's face on the screen looked curious but cautious. What kind of something? We discovered a critical flaw in your current system architecture. A designed inefficiency that's been costing you millions in operational overhead. Alexis had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, but her heart was still racing. The problem is, fixing it would require acknowledging that whoever installed the original system either made a massive error or deliberately created the problem. You're talking about the data processing loops you mentioned yesterday? Exactly. But Danny, I need you to understand, this isn't just a technical issue. It's potentially a legal one. If we're right about the deliberate nature of the design, you might have grounds for recovering damages from the original consulting firm. Danny's expression sharpened. How sure are you about this? 95%. But I wanted to warn you because you might hear alternative explanations from other firms. Claims that the loops are necessary for data integrity, or that removing them would create security vulnerabilities. Alexis paused, letting the implication sink in. Those explanations would be false, but they might sound plausible if you weren't expecting them. And if someone tried to feed me that kind of explanation? I'd suggest asking them to document exactly why those loops are necessary, and whether they had any role in the original system design. Alexis smiled. Just to avoid any conflicts of interest. 20 minutes later, she was sitting in Webb's conference room, watching Calvin set up his presentation with the smooth confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Jordan and Deshawn flanked her, their expressions carefully neutral despite the tension crackling between them. Since we're all here, Calvin began, I thought it might be useful to share some insights from the Hartford project that could apply to the Meridian engagement. He clicked to his first slide, System Architecture Optimization, Identifying Hidden Inefficiencies. Alexis had to admire his audacity. He was presenting their research almost word for word, complete with the technical diagrams Deshawn had spent days perfecting. The only differences were cosmetic: new fonts, different color schemes, the McKinsey and Sterling logo prominently displayed. As you can see, Calvin continued, modern enterprise systems often contain legacy elements that create unnecessary processing overhead. In Meridian's case, we've identified several data processing loops that appear to serve no functional purpose. Grace leaned forward from her corner. How did you identify these loops, Calvin? Standard architecture analysis. We mapped their current system integration and found several anomalies. Calvin's confidence never wavered. The key insight is that these loops aren't accidents, they're deliberate design choices that create ongoing maintenance requirements. Interesting, Webb said. And you're certain these loops are unnecessary? Absolutely. Removing them would eliminate approximately 40% of their current processing overhead while improving system responsiveness by an estimated 60%. Deshawn shifted in his chair. Alexis caught his eye and gave him a subtle shake of the head. Not yet. Calvin advanced to his next slide, Implementation Strategy, Phased Elimination of System Redundancies. For 20 minutes, he presented their work as his own, fielding questions with practiced ease. It was a masterful performance that would have been career-ending for Alexis if not for one crucial detail. Calvin had no idea what he was really saying. This is impressive work, Richardson said as Calvin wrapped up. Have you run this past the client? Actually, Calvin smiled, I have a call with Danny Rhodes in about 15 minutes, the architect. Deshawn becomes a full analyst with his own client portfolio. Webb's expression had shifted from cautious to calculating. You keep the people who helped you succeed. And Calvin's other direct reports? That's your decision. You'll have full authority to restructure the division however you see fit. Alexis Webb said finally, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Okay. Did you expose Calvin's fraud because you believed it was the right thing to do, or because you wanted to destroy his career? The question hit her like a physical blow. Not because it was unfair, but because it was so fundamentally right. She could have handled Calvin's sexism quietly, could have secured the Meridian contract without exposing the system fraud, could have won her personal battle without declaring war on the institutional corruption that had protected him. Both, she said finally. Calvin's comment about women not being able to handle pressure was the catalyst. But the fraud was real, and it was hurting our clients. I couldn't ignore that. Even if it meant destroying your own career? Even then. Webb was quiet for a long moment, studying her with the focused attention of someone making a decision that would affect multiple lives. Grace, what's your recommendation? Promote her. The silver-haired executive looked stunned. Promote her? She's created a public relations nightmare. She's demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership we need if we're going to rebuild client trust, Grace interrupted. She put client interests ahead of personal loyalty, exposed fraud instead of covering it up, and secured our biggest contract of the year in the process. Webb leaned back in his chair. What position? Calvin's position. Division Director. Full authority over client relationships and team management. Grace looked directly at Alexis. With one condition. Which is? You clean up the rest of Calvin's mess. Every client relationship, every questionable billing practice, every corner that was cut to maximize short-term profits. Grace's smile was razor-sharp. You wanted to change the system? Here's your chance. Alexis felt the weight of the offer settling over her shoulders. Division Director was the promotion she'd been working toward for 5 years, but accepting. It meant taking responsibility for fixing problems that went far beyond Calvin's individual misconduct. What about my team? Jordan gets promoted to senior data architect. Deshaun becomes a full analyst with his own client portfolio. Webb's expression had shifted from cautious to calculating. You keep the people who helped you succeed. And Calvin's other direct reports? That's your decision. You'll have full authority to restructure the division however you see fit. Alexis, up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.